So today, what I plan to do is discuss um, kind of a introduction to literature. That's the plan for today. Before you start going on the adventure of reading all this stuff, I want you guys to. I kind of want to give you a foundational lecture. Like, here's how to think about some of this. Here's how to approach literature. And the good thing about it is, all of you guys should have different interests as far as that goes. Um, some of you guys have different majors, like maybe for instance, you have an interest in psychology. Well, if you have an interest in psychology and literature go together like peanut butter and jelly. Um, if you have an interest in history, the same thing, right? The study of literature and history uh, go together well as well. So there's all kinds of critical schools and approaches to thinking about literature. The biggest thing that we have to consider is that we you don't want to approach consuming any type of media just as a consumer. What this class is trying to teach you to do in many ways is critically think. It wants you to think about stuff that you're consuming. It doesn't even matter. Of course, we're using written literature, but even things like films that you watch, uh, all this films you watch, videos you watch, um, any type of media really. I'm trying to teach you how to um, a new way of thinking about it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So let me start off by asking one of you guys a question. Um, how would you even define the word literature? Like, what is it? Like, what kind of books would you say is literature? Um, we can kind of go round table here and see what you guys think. Lucy, what would you say literature is? Like, how would you define it? What is it? How do you know it when you see it?
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, perfect. The word literature honestly sounds like, in my personal opinion, more like classic to me.
Okay.
But I guess it would apply to any book or anything you read, honestly. But I guess I'm not 100% sure the right answer to that question, but
Well, there is no right answer necessarily, but I think you're getting there. I'll explain why in a second. I think you're getting there.
okay.
But what would you say is classic?
Just kind of the all the books that most people have to read in high school, like um I remember reading Fahrenheit 451, stuff like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, stuff like Fahrenheit 451, Romeo and Juliet seems like a
Yes.
popular one.
Yes.
Um, so classic, we could say classic as in old stuff, right? In many ways.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to get at, I guess.
Good. So yeah, well, you're close. You're close to where I'm going with this. You've already gotten close. Good. You'll see how in a second.
Okay, perfect.
Allison, what about you? How would you define lit? What is it? When how do you know it when you see it?
Um, I would say about the same thing. Like when I think about literature, I just think about reading. Um, I would say like the same thing, like Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet, those kind of books.
Right. Old. So you're saying older as well.
Yes.
Okay, good. Benny, what about you? When you think of literature, how do you know it when you see it? What even is it? Maybe he's having technical difficulties. We'll get around. I'll circle back. Emily. Emily, just to read Emily's comment, she says, I agree with Lucy, and she said that literature is more classic to her. Think of older novels, poems, etc. Poe and Shakespeare are an example. So Emily's further kind of narrowing it down for us, even. She says things like novels and poems, right? That can constitute literature. Like whenever you think of literature, you think of things like novels and poems, maybe short stories as well. Fiction and poetry, it's kind of what she's saying, is a way that we can further condense it. So I dare say that Emily's definition is what many people would consider literature to be. Like whenever you think of literature, you think of things like novels and poems, short stories, and so we'll see if we can keep expanding that definition. But I think we're narrowing it down in an interesting way. Kaylee, you've had to suffer through reading literature with me before. How would you define literature?
A written work that has some value or meaning behind it.
Okay, so a written work that has some kind of value or meaning behind it. So let me ask you a further question, Kaylee. Who assigns value to the book, to the written work? Like, I guess to further clarify there, like what do you mean by value?
I guess it could like vary depending on who's reading it. Like it could be differently interpreted by everybody, like from person to person.
Right? Yeah, so value's all in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. So just like beauty, right? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Different people might value different works in different ways. Um, so, I really dig Shakespeare, right? But Kaylee might not, right? Maybe Kaylee likes something that I don't like, right? So that's an interesting definition, but it kind of muddies things a bit, right? Because whenever you think of a class like this, right? If it's all in the eye of the beholder, then how do we kind of assign? How do we kind of come up with even a reading list, right? So I'll get into that in a second. Let's keep going round table. Uh, Jalen, what would you say here for this question? What's literature?
I don't think my definition is very far off, I guess, from like everything that's been said. I mean, at least just every literature that I've like read and stuff like that, it's just been like, novels, short stories, poems, plays, stuff like that from like classic times that usually like reflect like culture or like some sort of history of like a certain time or place.
Gotcha. So you're kind of echoing some other folks, but you added plays to the list. um, something that kind of helps us understand history too. That's something that's another clarification you're adding to it too. Some good. Brittany. What's literature? How do you know it when you see it?
I agree with Jalen, especially yeah, especially about the culture and the values, especially around certain time periods, like Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare. I just like symbolism, structure, style. I guess literature is really defined individually because anything can be literature. It just depends on how you interpret it, really.
Good. You added some more wrinkles to this as well. You said it's works that have symbolism and style. And what was the other word you used? Symbolism, style,
Structure.
and structure. Yep. And so whenever you have that definition, you can further expand it out even into other things, like an essay, for instance. Um, essays have structure, right? They can have symbolism, even things like a famous speech or something like that. Think of like the Gettysburg Address or something like that, right? So we keep going. We keep expanding out even more and more. So, last but not least, is it Raquel? How would you correct me if I'm wrong on the pronunciation? How would
You're
you
close. It's Raquel.
Raquel? Gotcha.
Yeah. So for me, I would say literature. Yeah, when you think of literature, it is more like you think of old stories back then, like short stories and novels, nonfiction, and fiction. But I also would say there's a lot of literature in like today's day that maybe we don't notice as much. It could be just like a piece of writing or like maybe like a journal post with a lot of emotion, and we can learn a lot from it. So I kind of feel like literature is like everywhere, and it like covers so many different aspects of like life and different themes and genres.
Good. Yeah. And so you're further clarifying it out even to contemporary stuff. Like a lot of folks here have been saying older stuff. You're saying as well, like a lot of modern books as well. We can classify, or other types of media. We can also classify as literature. So good. Um, to kind of circle back around to, so this is all interesting. To kind of circle back around for my definition. Um, I'm going as broad as I could possibly go. The word literature comes from the Latin word literare, that means letters. So technically, under the etymology of the word, anything that's kind of written down um, can be literature. Well, that kind of raises questions like, so if you have like a court document, like a court brief, right, from 14th, well, is the court document literature? Well, no, not if we use some definitions that we said a second ago, right? Like it's something that has symbolism and style, right? Whenever we think of something like a dusty court document, right? Well, that doesn't really have symbolism and style. But technically, we could say anything written down can be literature. Okay, so a lot of you guys said some definitions like it's classic, it's older stuff. Um, you named some authors like Shakespeare or Poe. Um, well, I gave you and also one of you guys said something about value, right? It's whoever assigns value to it. So this is always a question that I think is fun to ask. Would any of you guys consider something like Twilight to be literature? Because whenever we think of Twilight, we kind of think to ourselves, okay, it's a fun story. Maybe it's a little cringy, right? But it's a fun story. Or even something like 50 Shades of Grey, right? It's a fun party activity to read some of the sentences from that book out loud. Just it's good for a fun laugh. Would you, even with something like that, right? Would we consider something like that to be literature? What do you guys think? I won't call on anybody specifically. I'll just throw that out to the whole class. 50 Shades of Grey or Twilight. Would you call that literature? Nobody's brave enough to take that question. Yeah, you guys all have some good stuff to say, though. So don't be shy. Speak up.
I'll say something.
Go ahead.
Just like assigning value, I feel like if it's significant, like culturally, like most people have read Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey or even like Harry Potter, stuff like that. I feel like if a lot of people have knowledge about whatever it may be, I feel like that makes it more literature, I guess, because so many people can discuss it and have their own opinions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, so something that has even a wide readership, we could say, is literature. Think about how many millions of people have read or watched Twilight. Right? Clearly resonated with people. There's like 4 or 5 of those books. So why not, under what you just said, Lucy? Why not classify it as literature? I'm looking at Emily's comment. I honestly feel like anything that attracts readers could be literature. It's definitely culturally significant for our generation. Yeah, for sure. So I would also classify it as literature, right? I think for what Lucy just said, right? Something that has resonated with a lot of people. We can say there's lots of interesting stories to kind of further add wrinkles to this conversation. You guys might have heard of a famous book about a guy hunting a white whale, right? It's probably the most famous book in American literature, called Moby Dick. Herman Melville published Moby Dick in 1852. Well, when that book first came out, even with the definition that we had just assigned to Twilight, when that book first came out, it was a critical flop. I don't know if any of you guys have ever tried to read Moby Dick, but it's an interesting novel. I'll just say that. Like there's like 100 pages in it just dedicated to talking about whale anatomy and stuff like that. It's a weird book. It's a great book, but it's a weird book. When it first came out, people didn't vibe with it, and it didn't sell many copies. I think Melville only sold about 1,000 copies of it during his lifetime. So imagine pouring your heart and soul into something like Moby Dick, and then it just kind of goes over so poorly. Only after his death did people dig Moby Dick out of like the dust bins and read it and think to themselves, darn, this is a really good book. So that's kind of sad, right? A story like Melville didn't really strike a chord with audiences until after he was dead. One of you guys said something a minute ago about contemporary. It's something like contemporary authors, if it's something that strikes a chord. I'll give you another interesting example there. In the 1840s in America, I'm a scholar of American literature. I don't know if that's something that I mentioned in last class, but even though I'm teaching you guys early lit up to the Renaissance, American literature is actually what I did my degree in. But another story from American literature, in the 1840s, there was a famous writer from South Carolina named William Gilmore Simms. I don't know if any of you guys ever saw that Mel Gibson movie called The Patriot from like the early 2000s. I really like that movie. But that Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, came from a William Gilmore Simms novel. But the thing with William Gilmore Simms is, if you buy a textbook, something like the Norton Anthology of American Literature, you open that textbook today, he's not even in there. He sold more books. So somebody like Herman Melville only sold 1,000 books in his life. William Gilmore Simms sold hundreds of thousands of books, and maybe even millions. I don't know. I don't have a number right off, but at least safely hundreds of thousands. He's not even in the book these days. I'll give you so think about it. 1840s. Where did I say he was from? What state? South Carolina, right? Can you guys draw an inference there? 1840s, South Carolina. Think about history, right? You guys see where I'm going with this? What was the institution that led to the Civil War, right? Slavery. Yeah, William Gilmore Simms and his books had a lot of racist content in the books. He would endorse the institution of slavery in his books. He would have characters that were like really happy slaves, and they couldn't imagine a life without being on the plantation with their master. There's lots of stuff like that in his books. So needless to say, he was kind of an author who didn't age well, so to speak. So even though he sold hundreds of thousands of books in his lifetime, boom, nobody, unless you specifically look for his stuff, nobody reads them anymore. The University of South Carolina has a whole initiative where they're trying to preserve his books, because his books are actually really good adventure stories and things like that. So they're trying to preserve his books, but I think they're kind of falling on deaf ears with almost everyone else. So today, if you buy Norton Anthology of World Literature, when you open it up, you look at the author list. There's, especially the pre-Civil War one, there's hardly any authors from the South in there. They're all New England authors, right? So you can kind of see a bias there, right? Different people. There's you could say there's a historical or a political bias there. Maybe for good reason, right? You really want to read writers who endorse things like slavery, right? Arguably not. So, where am I going with this whole conversation? It's as big of a definition as we can possibly throw at it. I, as the teacher, whenever I write a syllabus for a literature class, it's something that I don't take lightly, because it's kind of almost my role as an English professor to assign value to certain things. And what English professors assign value to is constantly changing. I'm the type of person, and I like a lot of what some of you guys said. I like a lot of the classics. And that's why I like to teach the earlier world literature instead of the more recent one. The more recent class, it's definitely more of a changing and growing field than what this class is, because we're always constantly trying to expand the canon, so to speak. So in the 1970s, when the feminism was sort of spreading in academia, lots of women writers were suddenly being read for the first time. And today, a lot of these women writers are just as canonical as Shakespeare. But before the 70s, nobody would ever read them, right? So today in the study of literature, we're doing more and more to kind of expand the authors we read. So we're looking at lots of different voices from different groups of people. So right now, I know Asian American literature is popular. Chicano literature is popular. Native American literature is popular. So more, I guess where I'm going with that is the field now is kind of expanding out, past the traditional power structures. Usually the power structures in literature is old white guys, right? They're trying to kind of expand. The field's constantly growing, trying to expand out the voices beyond just sort of the old dusty white guy authors. So with that said, let's now kind of take a look at this handout that I've prepared for you. So let me share my screen. So this handout I'm getting ready to go over, some of this stuff is not without controversy. I will explain how as I go. But in our current political climate, a lot of this stuff is pretty controversial. And what I want to try to do as I go is kind of demystify that. I think a lot of people are blowing some of these things out of proportion, and I'll explain why as I go. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. Can you guys see the text well, or do I need to further zoom in? One of you guys say something.
It's good.
It's good. Okay, good. So whenever you as readers approach the study, part of what makes a class like this interesting is different people approach the field different ways. And you guys, as you read, might be interested in one of these schools. Lots of times, you as a student will find that you gravitate more to one school than any others. So whenever we come together as a collective to discuss this stuff, that's part of what makes a class like this interesting. Everybody has different perspectives. So some of the main approaches then. Biographical approach. It says this approach makes the author the main concern and uses the text to illustrate some argument about the author. For example, you might investigate how various events in Dante's life led to his creation of hell and its various punishments in the Divine Comedy. So on my handout, I'm using examples of stuff we're going to read later. So a biographical approach. So what was going on with the author in his or her life, and how did that, whatever was going on in their life, perhaps influence the creation that emerged. Now there's a whole school of thought that's against the school of thought too, because it kind of raises the question, okay, the author created this work, but after the author created the work is the work. There's a whole school of thought too that's dedicated to who cares what the author might have meant or intended. The text says what it says. So this is an interesting question, even when you think of something like the Constitution of the United States, right? Like lots of times in constitutional law, different scholars are concerned, like, hey, what did Alexander Hamilton think about the Commerce Clause or something like that? So lots of people are concerned about author intent. So that's what you do in a biographical approach. You take something about the author, try to use it to make meaning out of the lit. Edgar Allan Poe. We're not reading Edgar Allan Poe in this class, unfortunately, but he's an author you would read in World Lit 2. But Edgar Allan Poe is an author that oftentimes people like to do with this school because he had such a tragic life with drug addiction and alcohol addiction. And then he wrote all these crazy stories like The Black Cat or The Telltale Heart. And lots of times when people read those stories, they think to themselves, okay, this guy was clearly disturbed. His addictions led to some demons. That's probably why he's writing about such weird stuff. So you kind of don't give Poe enough credit if you kind of take that school of thought, I think. Nonetheless, that's the biographical school. One challenge that we'll have with this school before I move to the next one in this class is lots of these authors are really old. I mean, going back to the BC times with Homer next week, right? Lots of these authors are so old, and sometimes we don't even know if that was a real author. Like Homer was almost a fictional creation. You think of him as this blind poet, but the Iliad and the Odyssey were oral stories. They were passed down from generation to generation through oral storytelling. Homer's just the name we ascribe to an author who we don't even know might not have even existed. So in this class, we're going to run into that problem sometimes. We just don't know a lot about the author, or for some of the texts, we don't even know who the author is. or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Another thing we'll read after midterm, we don't even know who the author is of that one. So sometimes this will be relevant, sometimes it won't. The School of Disability Studies. So this is a school that's kind of grown up over the past 10, 15 years or so. So disability study. So starting with this school, looking at some of the next few, like ecological, gender and race, social, political, cultural. Several of these schools are kind of political. So the study of literature oftentimes can be political, and political in a more liberal sense, I guess you could say. So whenever we think of disability studies, we'll look at how literature treats themes of disability. So like if you have a disabled character, for instance, right? Like what attitudes, stereotypes, things like that about disabled people are in this literature. And is the literature only reinforcing these stereotypes, or is the literature trying to humanize the character and try to make them more than what their disability is? So oftentimes with this field, it'll look at like how does literature, what are attitudes about the disabled? Like, so whenever we think of negative stereotypes about disabled people, like one that's often kind of thrown out is that disabled people are lazy, right? That, that's a stereotype that a lot of people have. Or they claim they have a disability, but that's only because they're just lazy. So whatever the case might be, if you ever notice something like a character has a physical deformity of some sort, maybe sometimes in literature, a lot of evil characters have some type of disability or other. Like Shakespeare had Richard III, and Richard III is one of his plays, and Richard III had a humpback in the story. He even gives a famous speech at the beginning about how since no one will ever love him because he's ugly, he might as well be the villain of the story and try to mess stuff up. So if you ever notice such themes popping up in the literature, hone in on it. Maybe pause a second. Maybe star your book. Highlight the passage, whatever the case is. That's something you can go back and think about later. I'm actually writing I haven't ever dabbled in this school much, but I'm getting ready to write a paper about John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. I don't know if you guys have ever read that one in high school. That's sometimes one that's taught in high school, Of Mice and Men. And I'm talking about the stories about Lenny and George. One of the characters is disabled. And at the end of the book, George is put down. So in the paper, I'm going to talk about things like eugenics and things like that. So I'm going to be talking about disabled. I'm going to be doing a disability paper for the first time soon. So the ecological studies of literature. How does literature treat nature? That's basically what this field asks. How does literature treat nature? Mankind, going back even since the biblical days, how do we think of nature? Are we part of it? Do we dominate over it? If you go back even to like the book of Genesis, God tells Adam in the Garden of Eden, you're going to be the steward over my creation. And that kind of suggests that man is over nature in some ways, but also man has a responsibility to protect nature. Some other, especially a lot of other cultures, like East Asian cultures, for instance, some of them, they think that man is part of nature, or that nature, if you look at the Hindu faith, right, oftentimes everything in nature is divine. And we, as humans, are just part of nature. Everything in creation is going to go back to the divine. So different cultures have different ways of thinking about nature. Here in the Western world, we tend to think of it in those Christian terms, right? That we are the stewards over nature. So if you ever notice, like, how does literature treat, like, how is nature being characterized? Is it depicted as a utopia? Is it depicted as scary? Setting is often, the problem of setting often comes into play with ecological studies. Is it scary? Is it nice? How are animals being depicted in literature? That's another popular field right now. So things of that nature, that's what the field of ecological studies is dedicated to. And this is one of the most popular ones right now. Like next week, next month, whenever I go to the Western American Literature Conference, that's one that I try to go to every year. All these people writing papers about Westerns. Probably, I'd say at least 60% of the papers at that conference will be about ecological studies. That's the hot thing right now. I personally don't gravitate to that one, but I always am interested in hearing people's papers and stuff on it, even though I myself don't really gravitate to that school. So if you notice something like that with nature, hone in on it. Think about it closely. So the School of Formal Studies, I don't know, lots of times high school English often kind of takes a formal studies bend. So like, let's say, for instance, you read a poem. In the poem, you might talk about things like, okay, how's that poem rhyme? How does that poem have meter? What are some symbols in the poem? Like a character got dipped in water, right? That must mean baptism, right? So you can make, that's a whole other conversation, but you can make symbols mean almost anything. But anytime you think of literature and you think about like literature terms and buzzwords and things like that, that is the School of Formal Studies at work. All these other schools don't work in our field without some degree of formal study. You always, whenever you guys will write your papers for me in this class, the main thing that you got to do often is quote from the text. You got to give the text as some evidence. So none of these other studies work without formal studies. However, why I have it listed differently is because back in the day, especially the 1950s, if you took the same class in 1950, it would be a radically different class. Look at all these literatures in all these different ways. Back then, they would come in and read a poem, and they would talk about its meter and rhyme and all that. They wouldn't talk about the history. He wouldn't talk about gender or race or any of these things. Why, you might ask? In the 50s, Joseph McCarthy led his Committee on Un-American Activities. And this was kind of a scare tactic of the day, right? His committee would label somebody to be a communist, and he ruined countless careers of people all across the country by just accusing them of being a communist. And all university professors were scared for their jobs. So whenever they talked about literature, they kind of tried to divorce it from politics in any type of way. And that's when this field was most popular, was during that time. Of course, if you know about McCarthy's committee, it fell apart whenever he finally grilled, I think it was a disabled veteran. He tried to call a disabled veteran a communist. And the guy asked him, he said, "Sir, do you not have any decency?" And that moment, the media picked up on it. He said what everybody was thinking, but everybody was too scared to say. And that kind of led to the downfall of Senator McCarthy. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard that story in history class, but kind of interesting things that happened in the 1950s. We see echoes of it even today. Maybe not as extreme. So if you guys, I know I'm kind of ranting. I'm kind of rambling here, trying to burn through these. But if you guys want to stop me at any time and ask about one, just feel free to interrupt me. You can always interrupt me. I don't care. Okay. Gender and race. Okay. So here is I'm gonna take some time on this one. Here is the big one right now that's controversial in their current political climate: gender and race. So you guys might have heard, for instance, the boogeyman word going around right now, critical race theory. That's the boogeyman word going around in our current political climate. I'll be open with you guys. I'm not anymore. I'm not a very political person. Sometimes when you get a teacher for a class like this, oftentimes English teachers are called really liberal. I myself am a moderate. I try to sit in the middle on most things. So you don't have to worry about me proselytizing to you about politics. That's not what I'm here to do. But I will take a stance on this one. People who think of things like critical race theory as being bad, those people are morons. Okay, so let me explain why. So let's start with gender. Gender studies started with things like feminist approaches to literature, and it's a valid school of thought. Like, how does literature treat women? We need to have more women writers in our canon. Lots of things that we'll talk about in this class. We'll talk a lot about how literature treats women in this class, but a lot of this stuff comes from male writers, right? So, like, what types of attitudes about women is being perpetrated by literature? That doesn't sound that controversial, but when it comes to expanding it out, it has become more controversial. So the same thing in the 60s, there was an author named Judith Butler who I forget the exact name of her book, but Judith Butler came out with this idea that gender is more than just biology, right? Gender is socially constructed. So ever since that book, lots of times in colleges and stuff, that's how gender is taught. It's more than just biology. It's something that's socially constructed. So today, of course, there's all kinds of discussion of gender. It's more than just two genders anymore, right? Whatever your stance on that topic may be, and I will just say that I think when it comes to the field of literature, and I think it's interesting. My opinion is I think we should try to expand our authors out as much as possible. So if voices of people who might be on the margins when it comes to things like gender, we should hear their voices, right? Just like we hear everybody else's voices. Notice here, I have a sentence here that says you might be interested in, quote, queer studies, where a text might be making a case on any sexuality other than heterosexuality. I put the word queer in quotes there because whenever you think of that word, it's often a nasty word, right? Like if you talk about somebody who's gay or something like that, that's often a slur. What scholars of that field have done, they have taken a slur and tried to make it into something empowering. So they tried to redefine the word, turn it to us from a slur to something empowering. So the study of sexuality in literature, especially not the mainstream heterosexuality, right? That's called queer studies of literature. And we'll see some of this in this class, even next week. The ancient Greeks were much more liberal about these things than even our current culture. So we will see this stuff showing up in literature. But the last one to talk about is race. And again, the race theory started as an attempt to expand voices in the canon. So like we need more authors from different races. Okay. But the race theory one has gotten controversial in the sense that it has taken race theory's kind of developed a thesis that says that especially in current society, if you let's say for instance, if you're African American, African American people have a naturally harder time in sort of thriving and making it than white people. That's the central thesis of critical race theory. I don't know what you guys think, but whenever I think of that, I think to myself, it doesn't sound like that controversial of an idea to me. I don't have to deal with racism as a white dude, right? I don't have to deal with that. I don't have to worry about getting pulled over by a cop or something like that. So that's what people were so upset about. Whenever people say something like critical race theory, that's the devil. They're upset that about that central thesis that saying that marginalized groups of people have a harder time making it than white people. I don't think that's controversial at all, but that's just my opinion. So today, all these politicians, including in this state, our governor passed an executive order forbidding college professors and high school teachers from even talking about this subject. You know how much of a crap I give about his order? None. Okay. So what I'm trying to do here is demystify the idea for you. I don't think it's that controversial of an idea. But that's just my opinion. So take that for what you will. But the study of gender and race is critical to the study of literature. We'll be discussing gender and race quite a bit in the class. Even the Greeks, whenever the Greeks talked about other people who weren't Greek, like one of the first stories we'll read is called Medea. Medea is one of the most evil characters in all of literature. But why is she evil? Well, she wasn't Greek, right? That's part of why she is depicted as being so evil. You guys have any questions about that one? I tried to handle that in a way that was fair and balanced. But any questions or even a comment about that before I finish up? That's about as political as I'll ever get in this class. Okay, so don't worry about me being a professor who's going to give you sermons. Right? That's not what I'm here to do. All I tried to do is just try to show you that ideas are not as controversial as what people are making it out to be. Okay, so influence studies. How did one author influence another? So, like for instance, how did Homer influence Milton? Milton wrote Paradise Lost. It's an epic poem. Homer wrote the original epic poem of the Iliad and the Odyssey. How did one author influence the creation of another? That's always an interesting question. That's a question that we'll keep building as we go through the course. Right? The more and more authors we get, the more and more connections we can make between them. So the last two psychological studies, again, the study of literature and psychology go together like peanut butter and jelly. The thing with literature, though, is I don't know if you guys have taken on any psych courses with Dr. Matushik or Professor Mullins or somebody else. But oftentimes today when we think of field of psychology, we think of brain chemistry, we think of the science of psychology. Whenever literature thinks of the field of psychology, we think of more of like these old school psychologists like Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan and people like that. We're more interested in human behavior more so than the science. And we're interested in it because there's so many great characters in literature. And part of the fun of it's trying to unpack their psychology and their motivations. So we're gonna do this in very short order soon and talking about the play called Oedipus the King. Oedipus the King is about a guy who accidentally marries his own mother, right? So today we call, I'll talk about the psychology of all that when we get to it. So a lot of psychologists like Sigmund Freud took inspiration from this literature, even in coming up with their theories about what makes human beings tick. So if you like psych, you're in the right place. I think the two classes go together hand in hand. And the last school to discuss just really shortly is history, social, political, cultural. So some of you guys said that earlier in our discussion that oftentimes literature will depict the history of the times. Think of something here like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, right? The Grapes of Wrath is oftentimes called the Great Depression novel. It kind of showcases what the Great Depression was like. Oftentimes, there's a claim made about literature that the best literature is something that you don't need to know anything about the history about, and it'll still make sense. Like you don't need to know about history to understand Hamlet, right? But the study again, the two studies go hand in hand. What was going on in the society at the time? How did whatever was going on perhaps shape what the author created? That's kind of what the field of social, political, cultural is all about. When it comes to my own scholarship, I tend to write a lot about history in literature. Like my whole my doctoral dissertation, for instance, was about the American literature in the 1800s and the problem and the historical problem of medical professionalization. What I mean by that is there was a whole debate in the 1800s. Should doctors actually have to go to medical school in order to be a doctor? Or is it enough to train to be a doctor under another doctor? Do they have to go through all this college training in order to do it? And you think to yourself, well, yeah, if I'm going to have a surgeon operating on me, I want them to have some education, right? But that was a very controversial idea in the 1800s. So my project then kind of looked at different writers and how did they handle that subject in different ways in their own genres. So that's what my project looked at. So I took a historical problem, applied it to surveying a wide variety of literature. That was the project that I did to become Dr. Yeager. I got so burnt out writing the project that I've never revisited it since then. In order to get a doctorate, you got to write 200 or 300 page dissertation. Imagine writing a paper that's 200 or 300 pages. So yeah, that's what I did. So this is how my brain works in literature. Often when we get to class, my lectures or discussions, this will be very historically heavy. So I'm going to rely on you guys to help me with some of these other ones that I don't dive into as much. Well, hopefully you guys found that to be an interesting class. I always think it's kind of necessary to do it right before we start reading stuff. So hopefully I gave you at least a way of thinking about literature that you never have thought about before. I hope you found it interesting. So let me this next week you are starting Homer's The Iliad. You're going to read for next Monday book 1 and book 6 of the Iliad. By book, that's just a word for chapter, really, whenever we talk about Greek literature. So don't sound alarmed. Don't be alarmed. All it means is pretty much chapters. So you're reading chapter 1 and 6. And that's going to give us an introduction to all the characters at play. So Achilles and Hector primarily. Next Wednesday we will finish it, and we will talk about 16, 22, and 24. So if you guys want to get ahead a little bit past book 6 over the weekend, might not be a bad idea. Maybe at least do 16. That way that gap between Monday and Wednesday isn't as rough. And your first writing assignment will be due on the Iliad shortly after that, your first reading log. And so you'll, even though the writing assignment won't be due until after the fact, you'll do keep up with the lecture for next week, so that we'll be able to have good conversations where it's just not me talking the whole time. And I think I have that up on our Moodle. Let me just take a quick peek before I release you to see the readings. That is, I have, because you guys haven't had time to get your books in yet, I've provided you the reading. Let me just see if it is in fact there. Okay, I'm enabling it for you right now, so you should be able to access it. I will check it right now to enable it. One other thing, do not forget to do that discussion verification post for this week, because that's how I prove your enrollment to the college before next Monday. So please do that. In addition, I'm going to move the AI quiz back because I still need to explain that more. But in addition, take that introduction to literature quiz. You can now do that after hearing today's class. It's very easy. So you can take that before next Monday as well. That'll take you all of 5 minutes to do. Easy grades going into the grade book for those two things. So try to get that discussion done by Friday, so I can check off your name in the box that you're taking the class, and you can take that introduction to literature quiz by next Monday. Okay. Let me just real quickly take attendance, and I will let you guys be on your way. That won't take me long. Just a second. This class had 18 people, and only 10 of you were here today, so that's not a good sign. Let's see. See, Brittany's here. I saw Brittany's name earlier. Just take a quick look. I see Allison Alston is here. I'm just going to call, rather than trying to look at each name and check off, I'm just going to do this real fast, try to just call names out. Just tell me if you're here or not. Emily Boswell. Thought I saw Emily's name earlier. Yeah, Emily's here. Okay, I see her. Angelina. Yeah, I see Angelina's name there. Okay, good. Nathan Cook. Okay, no Nathan. Nicholas Diaz. Is there a Nicholas here? Nope. Okay. Mandy. Is there a Mandy here? No. Okay. See, Adriana. Is there an Adriana here? Nope. Greenhall. Jalen. I saw Jalen here earlier. Okay. Raquel. Let's see. Yeah, Lucy's here. Good. And Benny and Kaylee, I got you all as well. So everybody's free to go. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next week.